Welcome to part 2 of this Master Series. This time we get to have the amazing opportunity of studying Frank Frazetta, a true master and someone who is absolutely worthy of our attention. As you can see, my attention is just sucked onto this image. Everything about the musculature, the color palette, the mark making, the texture, the pose, the gesture, it's all so riveting. Frank Frazetta is a true master artist, and it's going to be a lot of fun to learn from him and get some inspiration on becoming better artists ourselves. And one of the things I think is a huge point of learning whenever I look at Frazetta is just the way he draws form, especially the form of the human figure. The figure is, the timeless subject of artists from across cultures. And I look at Frank Frazetta and I see the way, we oftentimes construct the human form. We draw things that are like cylinders and spheres and cones. But when I think of Frazetta, I think, no. I think we need to draw things that are like pears and boulders and things that are a little less symmetrical and a lot more kind of bold and fleshy. And I think whether you're drawing a muscular hero or, a strong tiger or a pile of rocks, the Frazetta way of constructing it feels weighty, filled with gravity, filled with power, filled with flesh. And I think it doesn't matter, if you're drawing a human figure or an animal or a snowbank, everything he draws is kind of sensuous. It's kind of full of this kind of like potential energy. And so let's just take a quick look. I mean, sometimes when you just sketch out something that let's say this. There's a way of thinking about things where you just look at it, right? So like if you look at the image in the lower right quadrant, you see the woman's hair. But let's sketch it, because when you sketch it, you really feel it. That helps you truly see it. Her hair is in a wild orientation. If you ever sat down and tried to draw hair like that, you'd be like, what? This is weird. Why? It's almost inverted, anti-gravity. But the way he draws it is so full of energy, power, intensity. And it again has some of those suggestions of the overlapping volumes of the form of a pear. And then you can draw like her torso there. It's sort of like an inverted almond shape. And then you got to kind of figure out these big kind of angles and shapes that turn into the rib cage, that then turn into kind of where the stomach is, and then the hips. And the way he draws all this stuff is so full of kind of human fleshiness, is like all I can think about. And, in the modern era where everybody is very, almost like gym or weight room obsessed, we draw a lot of figures that are either incredibly muscular and very, very lean, or maybe we exaggerate. We have like these caricatures where you have someone who's maybe a little on the heavier side. Then here's the athletic person, and then here's the, whatever. We have these like character types. But Frazetta drew things in a very different way, and I love the way he draws the figure. I don't think it has a modern analog. I think his work is just very powerful that way, and I love the way that the hand here and the spear and all this kind of erupts out of the shape of the hip there, and he really has this sense of where the power comes from in the body. And as you can see, this figure standing there holding on to this like lion tiger thing, her power comes out of her hips, out of kind of that central torso area. And it erupts up into the torso and through the hair. And you can see her holding on to, as if she's like holding back this, this giant big cat with its amazing cat power. And she's just holding it almost like effortlessly. It's just this wild image, and you see it and you're like, dude, that's cool. It looks awesome. But when you start to break it down and you sketch it, you can feel like all the energy in the faces of the cats, and you feel all the power in their claws, and you feel like the stoicism in her face, and you feel the strength in her legs and her hips. And you feel that kind of like flexation or kind of like contraction in her stomach as she's kind of pulling back against this big, powerful cat. And all of that really comes to life as you sketch it out. you feel it intuitively when you look at it, but to sketch it is something else. Sketching is the key, though, when you think about the preliminary work of someone like Frank Frazetta, and sketching in ink is something that I truly, truly, truly admire about his work. If you've ever been to a museum and seen some of the old masters and the way they do these like cartoon or doodles or under sketches or pre-drawings, you will be mesmerized at the amazing confidence in their way of generating whole compositions just really rapidly and beautifully. The kind of mastery and faculty they have of being able to use a very limited amount of strokes to create a maximum amount of impact. That is kind of the signature of the master artist. And I think I love looking at the sketches of artists like Frank Frazetta and then in the fine art world, like the Da Vinci's and the Rembrandts and stuff, because the way they handle these more delicate line-based tools like ink, it just speaks volumes. And I have to talk about ink here because Rebelle is so good at generating realistic ink. I have never in digital ever felt a tool where I could draw with inks like I can in Rebelle. It is so much fun. Sometimes I'll still forget to change like the tilt of the canvas, so I'll sometimes still get drips and stuff when I don't mean to. But it is something you have to consider in real ink drawing, and it's cool that you have to consider that in Rebelle. I loved being able to redraw this, kind of do this like master copy of this Frazetta ink sketch in Rebelle because it was incredibly fun, number one. Number two, it helped me kind of get it to come to grips a little bit with his gestural, body, bold, kind of fleshy approach to the human figure. And then I just think on a technical side, it's just very satisfying to work with a digital tool that has such a traditional kind of output. The look and the feel, it reads like real ink. And it also feels like real ink when you're putting it on the canvas. So I think here you can see a little bit of a drip happening that I forgot to adjust for, but I'm even going to do my signature in the style of Frank Frazetta, just kind of getting into the spirit here. He is a totally fun master artist to copy, and Rebelle is probably the only place you could do it in the digital realm that would have any chance of replicating both what he can do with oils and what he can do with like more wet on wet materials and what he does with ink. So cheers to Rebelle here, and cheers to Frank Frazetta for being such an amazing artist. So I wanted to do one further ink study just to kind of play a little bit more before we did the final Frazetta illustration. And we did one where it's sort of like an ink quill dipped in like India ink or Chinese ink or something like that. And then you're just kind of putting down those delicate little lines and building your value through hatching, cross-hatching, that kind of thing. But a lot of artists who use ink will also use a brush, and they'll just, have either one jar of ink and a jar of water, and they do different dilutions to create different values. Or they will pre-mix different dilutions, like for different intensities or grays. And that was something I wanted to test out with Rebelle as well. And you can see it works out beautifully. Just an incredibly fun tool. So inks are a plus, but also I wanted to talk about watercolor, because when I ran across this like Mothman, Butterfly Man, kind of Alien Man image in Frank Frazetta's body of work, I thought, holy crap, I bet you could do that in Rebelle. So my approach to this was I wet the whole area. So like I drew the wing shape, right, in pencil. Then I used the water tool, which is literally just water, and you put water, quote unquote, on the canvas within that kind of contour that I drew. And then I used the water-based media, watercolor, and I started to just pool and drip and apply mark inside that wet area. So basically I'm doing a wet on wet painting, right? Wet media onto a wet canvas. and just seeing what happens. Because I don't do a lot of watercolor in real life or in Rebelle, this was something I just had to try. And you guys wonder about, like, why would you do a master series? Why copy master artists? Well, there's tons of reasons. Number one is they're, in almost every case, going to be way further down the road in their art journey than a lot of us are, right? So we're going to learn a lot. Number two, the masters not only have like amazing brush mileage and experience, and they just know so many things, but they've probably explored and experimented with a different array of materials than we've experimented with. And they've tried techniques that we haven't tried, and they've gone down roads that we haven't gone. And so I think it's not just their mastery, but it's also the kind of the spectrum of their experience, right? They have an array of mastery. They have a whole body of knowledge. And so I thought it's just a really good example of why the Master Series is a fun thing to do, is because it just gives you inspiration, right? When you're sitting there in your sketchbook, your digital sketchbook, and you're like, what do I want to do today? Well, this is not what I ever thought I would be doing. But because I started doing this Master Series work, I end up playing around and tinkering around with what watercolor effects can do inside of Rebelle, and how realistically that can emulate this wet on wet feel. And it's amazing, and it works. So on to the next thing. All right, finding the form. We're going to draw a figure inspired by Frank Frazetta as kind of a keystone for our final project for this Master Series. And the goal of this is to just have some fun, because I don't know about you, but Frank Frazetta and the images that he creates, staring at that for too long, it just feels like I'm standing in the middle of the best comic book shop, or in a sci-fi fantasy novel section of a bookstore, or like I'm reading the script of some epic D&D story. Frank Frazetta's characters, they stand kind of at the pinnacle of that whole genre of creativity and storytelling and character design. And getting to work on something inspired by all of that kind of rich fantasy lore, character classes, epic storytelling, classic storytelling, that's all Frank Frazetta. And that's that world that he creates with every one of his images. So this is just a lot of fun. In order to do this, we're going to start with a pencil tool in Rebelle. And I can't ever say it enough how good every single tool in the toolbox of Rebelle works. Pencils work like pencils. They draw with a variation in line weight that makes them feel like real pencils, right? They skim across the canvas, leaving just enough texture to feel like a real pencil. And there's a huge array of options. So not only does brush tilt work and the texture of the canvas or paper or whatever you're using, but it all just feels like a real pencil. And but you have the huge benefit of digital, where you can flip the canvas back and forth and transform and rescale and resize and all that stuff. It's just the best of both worlds. And it's one of those things where if you just had one tool you had to choose, Rebelle has to be like right up there, if not the one, right? Because it's so good, so versatile. You can draw with it like a traditional digital drawing app, but you can draw with it also like you're using real paint. And for me, there's nothing like it. So here's my sketch. And I wanted to do not just like a strong kind of sword and sorcery character there. I wanted to do a male-female combination. I feel like, the female sketch is fine. It doesn't have enough of that kind of like fleshy fullness of a Frank Frazetta character, but it was it's just hard to draw like that. Like, it's just so different that I was like, well, whatever, this is close enough. And then the male character, I felt like his gesture and kind of like the stance, the kind of weight of his pose, it felt pretty good. So I'm like, well, I got 1 out of 2. And so going from that, we want to start doing some local color blocking. And the important thing when you're doing this is It's my recommendation to either use the oil brushes or the express oil brushes for this, because the goal isn't really like your perfect brushwork or the blending or anything like that. You're just really trying to get the color families in all of the right places and just get it down really quick. So I was just using some express oils, and it works great because it's kind of just like a simplification of all the oil tools. Just like gets it down. There's not a lot of fancy stuff going on. It's just quick, simple painting. So taking again inspiration from Frank Frazetta with that big geometric shape in the background. In this case, it can be like a big moon in the background. That kind of reminds us of the same concepts, tools, approach that we learned from John Harris. So this is again why I put these two together. Not just that they're great, legendary artists that have lived and worked in a lot of our lifetimes, but also the way that they use big geometric shapes, both in the foreground and in background elements. I just think it makes for some fun and epic design. So a lot of Frank Frazetta's work was used not just as like beautiful panels for everything, but a lot of times like cover art, it really helps to have these big designs like this, where you have these big striking images, but you also have a lot of negative space so that you have room for the titles and the author and all the text that needs to go on there. The images work as they are, just as like a poster design. So it's really cool to see kind of how these images could work in multiple ways based on the application. And that's a good kind of thing to think about when you are designing images like this. But I wanted to point out just a couple things about the color theory that I'm doing here now. And again, we're just using some of the express oils. I was using this photograph of this kind of like First Nations man in kind of like some traditional garb, and he's got a baby in his arms. It's this really sweet image, but I grabbed that image and saved it because I just knew one day, someday, I would want to paint something with that kind of lighting. And so the shadows that are cast from his face and down onto his chest, those colors were really helpful in getting what I wanted out of this image. So I used that image for a lot of the color for this image. And then I love this handling of this sailor, where you've got some direct highlight on the forehead and on the cheek and the nose, but then you have most of the face is in shadow, and those shadow colors is what I wanted. Again, I wanted rich shadow colors for both figures in this kind of double figure composition. And a lot of what I'm doing here is just finding the colors. And I've sped this up quite a bit just because there's really not a lot that you can learn from watching someone render all this stuff in real time. There's just a lot of like thinking and backtracking and playing and tweaking. Where we're working toward in the end is that we're just looking to get a light, a midtone, and a dark, and get the color families kind of right and the color temperatures kind of right for that light, midtone, and dark. And then in the end, we're going to do some just kind of careful blending to a degree, because one of the big differences between how I normally paint and how maybe a Frank Frazetta illustration would work is that his paintings have a lot more of the blending of the gradients between tones and like softer transitions, where I like to leave the raw brush strokes and leave things more impressionistic. He has more of like a refinement and a polish and a blending to his final product. And it's totally fine to paint either way. It just, a lot of times like it's going to depend on what your client wants or what the job demands stylistically. But it's just good to know how to do everything. And what's cool is in Rebelle, you have the little tool settings where you can either paint with a little mix, blend kind of a 50-50, and then just blend and then erase. And you can take any brush in the entire tool set of any tool family, and you can turn any single tool into a paintbrush, a paint mix brush, a mix blend kind of hybrid, a smudger blender kind of brush, or an eraser. And that is so useful because let's say that the real difference between painting like Frazetta or painting like Sargent is that you have just a different sort of brushwork and brush handling, and the way you're kind of modeling those surfaces is going to be different. And so you just change the amount of blend in your brush. You change the amount of you just change the tool. Whereas like Sargent, you're doing more direct painting, right? You're just slamming that brush down there and leaving all that kind of immediacy of the what you call like alla prima action of the brush. You leave it raw. Whereas if you're painting like this illustrator, Frank Frazetta, you're getting in there and you're modeling those surfaces a little more. You're blending them out. You're smoothing your values together a little bit more. And so it's just kind of up to you what you want to do stylistically. But for this one, I did a little bit more blending, but I didn't want to go full Frazetta because I just don't care about that unless the client says, I really need it to look like this, right? So that said, I did want to point out a couple quick things. As you can see, I'm shifting references all around. You can see the reference image from Frazetta of the woman who's right there just looking kind of concerned. You know, she's like looking back and her hand is reaching back toward whatever she's seeing that she doesn't want to be there. That face is really quintessential Frank Frazetta face. And I think it speaks to the schema that he uses for a lot of the figures that he paints. And so you can see the nose is very small, kind of a pointed sort of little nub. Again, not like anime or anything, but not all that different from anime either. It's definitely its own schema, but very small, kind of delicate nose, and then kind of full lips, and then these eyes that have kind of this slanty point to them, especially on that kind of outside edge. So if you're looking for like that Frazetta schema, like that might be like a good face to use as something to jump off of if you're looking to say, yeah, this is kind of what we're going for. Something else I want to point out is look at the man's face next to her, and just look how crudely and roughly it's handled by Frazetta. The shadows and the light on the cheek and stuff like that. It's just very rough and very kind of simplified. So even when you're kind of looking at, sometimes you think, oh my gosh, looking at the old masters, like they're like, oh, this is so much work. This is going to be so hard. Sometimes you look at some of the supporting cast in some of the paintings and you go, oh, wow, they just kind of like roughed that in. And it's those parts of a painting when you look at them and they give you some confidence to be like, hey, I can do this, you know? It's just blocks of light and dark. And so even if you've got an artist that does a lot more of the careful rendering and blending and stuff, there's still areas in every painting that are just kind of like roughed in. And another place to look at that's kind of helpful to get a little bit of confidence if you're like, oh my gosh, this is so intimidating, is hands. You can look at the hands in like even like a John Singer Sargent painting. Sometimes the hands are just kind of scumbled in, just scribbled in, and instead of painting the hand, they kind of just paint around the hand and get kind of the contour. And so, you know, all artists have those parts of the painting you're like, ugh, I don't really care about that, or oh, I don't really want to paint that, or oh, that's good enough, you know. And I think whether that's based on the timelines with the client, or whether it's based on the fact that you're painting outdoors and the sun is moving and you just got to paint fast, or whether it's just not important to you, there's always these parts of the painting where you see things are a little more raw, a little more fresh. And those are the parts where you can enter into that and be like, hey, you know, maybe I'm struggling to get this beautifully rendered part of the nose or something, but it's not all like that. And in fact, every part of the painting starts out kind of rough and tumble, and it starts out a little bit awkward, or it starts out looking a little bit quirky. And so it's important to just kind of get in there focus on your values, work your lights, work your darks, get your midtones in the right places kind of, and everything will start to fall into place, fall in line. And it's okay to change things. It's okay to make mistakes. If you look right now, I've been reworking the legs such that there's like 2 or 3 different poses for each leg throughout this painting. And so I haven't really decided, even at this point when I've got color on a lot of the canvas and I've been modeling the lights and the darks and kind of going back and forth, I still haven't decided what I'm doing. Like, I keep changing the hair, I keep changing the feet, I keep changing the calves, I keep changing the lower legs, I keep changing the lighting. And this is one of the reasons I left this here, is not just that Rebelle is awesome and you can grab all kinds of different brushes and settings and just move things around, and paint and repaint and paint and repaint. But I think it's important just kind of artistically to, as a teacher, to be like, hey, a lot of times we have an idea and we go in and we change it, and then we change it again and we change it again. And it's so important to kind of just feel it and to follow your nose, so to speak. Like my initial rough, it didn't work out, and I just kept wanting to redo it. And another little tip as you're working, I got kind of stuck. It got to a point where I was painting the female figure so much that I was just like, I just needed a break, and I needed to have something else to focus on. So I was grateful to have this second figure, the male here, to paint. And I think what's funny is, and this happens all the time, is that he just worked. Like, as you can see, it jumped quickly from that initial lay-in to bam, it's done. Like, I just painted him and he just worked. It was like the first time I painted him was all I needed. I didn't need any second, third, or fourth tries. The lights worked, the darks worked, the bounce light on his face worked. I liked the swoop of his hair. I just felt like it was all just good. For the female, I painted her hair like 15 times, and in the end I just decided to put a helmet on her and some bracers and some armor, and I just changed her a lot because I could never kind of decide what I wanted. And when that happens, that's okay. Just kind of go for it. Like I say, just follow your nose. And then another thing was just needing to paint the ground level quite a bit. It just really needed a lot more attention. And it could have gone a lot further with the ground, but I think I just wanted to go, kind of like a mild level finish. Again, not trying to go full Frank Frazetta here, just an inspiration. So you can see that at this point, I'm still redrawing the legs. I'm still redrawing the feet. I'm still trying to figure out that balance between that kind of cartoony gestural approach and that kind of realistic blending. Is this kind of interesting hybrid between the two. So painting in this way is a lot of fun. It feels like you're doing something, straight out of a 1970s like fantasy novel. And that is like, reason enough to just jump in there and go for it. But there are a lot of things that are unique when painting Frazetta art. The colors feel 70s, 1970s. The figures feel kind of 1970s. Everything kind of feels like 1970s. And you can kind of live in that world a little bit, and it kind of starts taking over. So I found that as much as I loved it, it was something that, like, I know I couldn't work like that all the time. That isn't my main interest, but I did have a lot of fun with this. I decided I wanted to paint like some sort of goblin or something that she had resting her foot on, and the sword is like in the back of the neck of the goblin, and then like maybe some shield and armor of the goblin is there, and they got to put some like straps on his arm. And then I was like, as I'm painting, I'm like, man, he needs some like cool pants and some like leather pants on the goblin, and maybe a better defined forehead muscles, and maybe some blood coming out of the sword. And just a lot of little elements. And I still haven't even painted her knees and the light of the torch and making that light bounce. And there's just so many little things that if this was a client project or this is something I needed to do for a book cover, I would spend so much time on a painting like this. But the sake of being a demo for, just a teaching demo, I felt like this was way enough information. Totally gives the idea of like what being inspired by Frank Frazetta looks like, and then totally gives the idea of the versatility of Rebelle and all of the amazing tools. So that said, I want to show you something else. So I want to show you some recent work of mine that's very much inspired by Frank Frazetta and John Harris. This one has like the beginning of some panthers on the rocks with these female figures that are like climbing up this waterfall, and all the atmospheric perspective, which is very John Harris, and the figures, which is very Frank Frazetta, and the way that the light and the dragon there and the kind of cavern of light behind them, that is a piece that's totally inspired by the two artists we just looked at. This one, just again, that kind of centrally located, very dynamic landscape, John Harris inspiration there. And then even when I just paint portraits, in the back of my mind, some of those wild color combinations from Harris and Frazetta are always kind of in my mind, and that's what played into this one. I have a whole history of like wanting to paint figures and fantasy art and sci-fi art that's inspired by these two. This image was totally inspired by Frazetta. But this is an original composition that comes from looking at his work. This one was an old, early sci-fi fantasy art from me where I was learning digital art. And of course, the heavy influence of Frank Frazetta, all of the big cats and the mysterious figure on the throne. Here's another one from that same series. And you can see that, Frazetta's work was hugely important to me, especially in my early digital art days. Here was a total inspiration by John Harris. This one was painted, early in my understanding of digital art. And here, this is another one inspired by Frank Frazetta with that like very deep black backgrounds and monster art and stuff like that. And then here's another one where it's inspired by that kind of strength of kind of a strongly symmetrical geometric composition. So my artwork has always had this influence by these amazing artists, Frank Frazetta, John Harris. And I hope that looking at their work today and looking at what Rebelle can do with their work can influence and inform your own work, and you'll be able to do something really beautiful inspired by some of these great artists from the past. So thank you so much for your time, and happy painting.